The rain outside the courthouse fell in heavy sheets, like the sky itself was weeping for what was about to happen inside. The grand wooden doors loomed tall and heavy, their brass handles cold to the touch and the echoes of hurried footsteps on. The marble floor seemed to carry the weight of 100 untold stories people had gathered in whispers, filling the gallery with the thick scent of tension and damp coats. All eyes would soon be on a young girl, a girl whose presence alone would challenge everything. The court thought it knew. Her name was Amara, and she was only 16. Yet her dark eyes carried a lifetime of battles in them. She stood outside the courtroom clutching a thin folder to her chest, the papers inside trembling, with her hands. But it was not fear that made them shake, it was resolve. Inside the room, the judge sat already glancing through the case file, a practiced detachment on his lined face, while lawyers shuffled papers and adjusted ties. The opposing attorney smirked a small, cruel curl of the lips that suggested confidence in the outcome. They had underestimated her just as so many had done before. When the bailiff opened the door and called her name, the murmurs died instantly. She stepped in. The room, her worn shoes making soft taps on the polished floor, her posture straight, her chin high but not arrogant. Her hair framed her face like a crown, though she wore no jewels. Her voice was quiet when she greeted the court, but each syllable seemed to slice through the heavy silence. The judge motioned for her to take the stand, and in that moment, a strange stillness wrapped the room. Even the rain seemed to pause outside, as if the whole world waited for her to speak. The opposing lawyer leaned back, arms crossed, ready to dismantle her every word. But Amara opened her folder slowly and drew out a single page, its edges bent from being held too many times. She looked directly at the judge and began to speak not with the tone of a frightened child, but with the weight of truth itself. Every sentence hung in the air, heavy, unshakable, and with each word faces in the gallery began to shift. Some leaned forward as if afraid to miss a breath. Others looked down, unable to meet her gaze. By the time she was halfway through, even the smirk had faded from the opposing lawyer's face, replaced by a flicker of something unfamiliar, respect or perhaps fear. The judge's pen had stopped moving, his hands now folded tightly as if anchoring himself to the desk. The room was so quiet that the faint sound of her breathing between sentences felt deafening. When she finally finished, the air seemed different, heavier, yet somehow cleaner. The judge exhaled slowly, like a man who had been holding his breath far too long. The gavel had not yet struck, but everyone in the room already knew something had shifted. Amara set the paper down, her hands steady now, and met the judge's eyes without blinking. She had not come here to beg, she had come here to reveal, and she had done exactly that. The rain kept falling outside the courthouse, but inside the air was growing heavier by the second, and every person in that room could feel it. Amara stood there, her hands no longer trembling. The weight of the truth she carried seemed to give her a strange, unshakable stillness. The judge's eyes stayed on her, but for the first time they looked less like the distant gaze of an authority figure and more like the searching eyes of a man trying to understand what he had just heard. The opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, flipping through papers that suddenly seemed useless. His earlier confidence dissolving into the shadows gathering in the corners of the courtroom, Amara did not rush her breathing. She let the silence do what it was meant to do, force every ear to hear the echo of her words. She spoke again this time, not reading from her page, but from the depth of her own memory. Her voice dipped and rose like a tide, pulling the room with it. She described nights filled with fear, days painted with injustice, moments when she had been told her voice did not matter, and how every time she was pushed down, she learned to stand a little taller. The gallery listened without a single cough or shuffle. They were Caught in the gravity of her truth, she spoke of her father. A man whose hands had worked themselves raw to give her a chance at a better life. A man who now sat at the defense table staring at her with eyes wide, not from surprise, but from pride. He knew what it had taken for her to be here, standing in front of a room that did not expect her to have the strength to stand at all. The opposing attorney tried to interject, but the judge lifted a hand to stop him, a small but unmistakable signal that this was her moment, and no one was going to take it away. She told them about the evidence no one wanted to talk about the documents hidden behind layers of false claims, and the witnesses who had been too afraid to speak. She revealed the patterns, the lies, the small details that had been brushed aside as irrelevant, but together painted a picture too clear to ignore. With every word, the case the opposing side had built began to crumble like a wall with its foundation ripped. Away one juror leaned forward. Another wiped a tear from her cheek. Amara did not cry. She could not afford to. She had carried this story for too long to let tears blur its edges. The judge leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, his gaze flickered. To the prosecutor, then back to her. It was the kind of look that said everything without a single word spoken. She knew she had changed something here. Maybe not the whole world, but this room, this moment, this verdict could never be the same. She took a breath and delivered her last line, not with anger, not with desperation, but with a calm, steady certainty that made it impossible to ignore. And when she sat down, the entire courtroom stayed silent for a long beat, as if the walls themselves were holding on to her words. The rain outside finally eased, the gray light filtering through the tall windows, spilling across her face. And in that quiet, the truth she had spoken settled into every corner of the room, unshakable, undeniable. The judge let the silence stretch so long that it felt like the walls themselves were leaning in to hear his next words. But Amara sat without shifting her gaze, her back straight, her hands resting on the table as though even gravity could not press her down anymore across from her. The billionaire who had walked into this courtroom certain of his untouchable power now sat hunched in his chair, his sharp-tailored suit unable to hide the collapse happening inside him. His jaw was tight, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of fear and the slow dawning of a truth he could not purchase or twist in his favor. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time since the trial began, looked away from Amara as though avoiding the weight of what she had just laid bare. The jury's eyes were not on the evidence files anymore, not on the polished speeches they had heard earlier. They were fixed on her, every single one of them. Held in the quiet storm she had created, she thought back to the nights she had stayed awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, rehearsing this moment over and over in her mind. She had imagined stumbling, losing her place, hearing the snickers of those who thought she did not belong here. But none of that had happened, because when the moment finally came, something inside her had shifted. The fear that had always lived in her chest had burned away, leaving only the steady pulse of resolve. She could see her father in her peripheral vision. His head bowed as though trying to hide the tear that had slid down his cheek. He had told her once that truth was a dangerous weapon, and that if she ever picked it up, she had to be ready to face the fire it would bring. She understood now what he meant, because this truth had cost her nights of sleep, friendships that fell away when things became too dangerous, and the heavy shadow of threats whispered over the phone. The judge finally leaned forward, his hands clasped, his voice even, but with an edge that carried through the entire room. He asked the billionaire if he wished to respond. The man opened his mouth, closed it again, and for the first time since Amara had known his name, he seemed small, not physically, but in the way. His presence no longer bent the air around him. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but the man shook his head. Whatever defense he had prepared, whatever narrative he had built, had cracked wide open under the weight of her words. One juror, A, Man in his 60s leaned back in his chair with a slow, deliberate exhale as though a knot that had been wound too tight had finally loosened another juror. A young woman wiped her eyes quickly and looked away, embarrassed to be seen crying in. A courtroom. But Amara saw her and knew that what she had said had pierced deeper than facts and dates could ever reach. She had made them feel the truth, not just hear it. The bailiff shifted his stance near the door, glancing at the clock. But no, one else seemed aware of time moving forward. In that moment, time belonged to Amara, and the echo of her voice. Even the rain outside had stopped the muted light pouring through the high windows, painting the room in pale gold, as though the sky itself had paused to watch. The judge took a long breath and said they would recess for 30 minutes before the jury would deliberate. His tone was calm, but there was something in it, something that told Amara she had shifted the ground beneath this case. As people began to rise from their seats, she stayed sitting, her hands folded the way a soldier might hold their weapon close, knowing the battle was not over, but that the hardest shot had already been fired. Her father reached over and laid his calloused hand over hers, and in that small gesture, she felt every sacrifice, every silent struggle that had led her to this seat. The billionaire stood slowly, his lawyer murmuring something, but his gaze never left Amara, and she met it without blinking. Without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, there was no victory in her face, only the unyielding steadiness of someone who had refused to be erased. When the jury returned, the room once again sank into stillness. Amara's heartbeat was loud in her ears, but her expression remained unchanged. The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in his hand, the kind of paper that carried more weight than steel. He passed it to the judge, who read it silently before looking up. His eyes met. Amara's first, then shifted to the defendant. The verdict was read, and in that moment, every word she had spoken became more than a memory. It became the truth written into law. And the billionaire who had once towered over her world now sat as just another man stripped of the illusions that had once made him untouchable. Amara did not smile. She did not cry. She simply breathed in the stillness, knowing that the story she had carried all her life had not only been heard, it had been believed. And the sound of that truth settling into the room was the loudest victory she had ever known. The moment the gavel struck the bench, the sound cut through the air like a final heartbeat, sealing the fate of everyone in the room. Amara sat perfectly still, letting the echo fade. The jury began to file out, some glancing at her with that mix of respect and awe. People reserved for those who have faced storms and walked out standing. The billionaire, however, did not move. He looked as though the air had been pulled from his lungs, his once perfect posture sagging, his eyes distant as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. His lawyer gathered the scattered papers on the desk in sharp, brisk movements, avoiding his client's gaze. Her father stood slowly, his hand tightening on the edge of the table before he straightened. Fully, Amara felt his presence beside her without even looking. She knew the way his shadow fell across her was different now, heavier, not with burden, but with pride. He had carried so much of this in silence, believing the world would never grant them a fair hearing. And yet here they were, verdict in hand, the truth no longer buried beneath power and money. The bailiff opened the side door and signaled that she was free to leave for the day. As the courtroom began to empty, a low murmur rose. From the gallery, strangers whispering her name like a secret. They were almost afraid to speak too loudly. Some faces were openly emotional, others were calculating, trying to understand how she had managed to dismantle the billionaire's defense. In a few carefully chosen minutes, she kept walking, head held high, past the polished wooden rail and into the narrow hallway beyond. The hallway was already lined with reporters, their cameras flashing like sudden bursts of lightning microphones, pushed forward as voices tangled over one another. "Miss Collins, how did it feel to confront him in court? Miss Collins, did you prepare your statement ahead of time? Miss Collins, do you believe justice was truly served? She didn't stop for any of them. Her father's hand on her back, guiding her forward past the chaos. The sound of their questions chasing her, until the heavy double doors swung shut behind them. Outside the courthouse, the city felt different, somehow. The same streets, same sky. But the air carried a strange electric weight, as if it too had listened to her testimony and was now holding its breath. Traffic hummed in the distance, but up on the courthouse steps, people were gathered, strangers with signs, some scrawled with her name, others with messages about truth and courage. A woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you," as Amara passed. Another man clapped his hand over his heart without speaking. Her father paused halfway down the steps, his grip still on her arm, and for a long moment they just stood there looking out at the crowd. It wasn't the size of it that struck her, but the way the people looked at her as though she had spoken for all of them in some unspoken way. She thought back to the long nights spent preparing to speak in court, the doubts, the fear, the endless second-guessing, and realized that all of it had been leading here. A black sedan pulled up at the curb, the driver stepping out quickly. Her father guided her toward it as cameras continued to flash when she slid into the back seat. The door closing behind her, it felt like the first quiet she had had all day. Her father joined her on the other side, the driver pulling smoothly into traffic leaving the courthouse. Shrinking in the rearview mirror for a few minutes, neither of them spoke, the city passing by in streaks of glass and steel. Finally, her father turned to her, his voice low, almost rough with emotion. "You did it, Amara. You told the truth, and they heard. You." She met his eyes, and in that single glance, so much passed between them: years of struggle, the weight of silence, the courage it took to break it all down to a single moment in that courtroom. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her hands trembled slightly in her lap, and she let them. She had earned the right to feel everything. The sedan wove through the streets until they reached their neighborhood, a quieter place where the sidewalks were cracked and the lampposts leaned slightly with aged children. Played in the distance, their laughter bright and untroubled. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed how the neighbors were watching from windows and porches, some giving small nods of acknowledgement, others calling her name softly. She walked up the worn path to their front door, feeling the ground steady beneath her feet for the first time in years. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of coffee and the faint lavender her father used to keep in jars by the window. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a reminder that despite everything, the world kept moving. She set her bag down on the table, and for a long while she and her father simply sat together in the quiet, letting the weight of the day settle around them outside. The evening light began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor. But instead of feeling heavy, those shadows felt like a closing chapter. When she finally looked at her father again, she saw the man who had carried her through every hardship, the man who had taught her that silence could be a prison. But the truth was a key. She knew the fight wasn't over. Not entirely. There would still be voices trying to twist the story. Still people who would resent her for breaking the silence. But she also knew that after today, she would never again doubt her own voice, and that was a kind of freedom she had never imagined. The billionaire left the courtroom through a side exit flanked by 2 security guards, his face pale and unreadable, but his eyes betrayed something raw and unguarded fear, mixed with humiliation, the kind a man like him had probably never tasted. In public, before outside that hidden doorway, a swarm of reporters still found him, their voices cutting through the air with questions about fraud and lies and what it felt like to lose to the very people he once dismissed. Without thought, he said, nothing but his clenched jaw told its own story as he was ushered into a waiting car that sped away, leaving the chaos swirling in his wake. By the time Amara and her father were home, the story was already everywhere on the news on social media. On people's lips across the city, headlines blared variations of the same theme: Black girl faces billionaire in court, and when some articles called it the trial of the year, others framed it as a modern David versus Goliath. But the videos circulating online were the most powerful. A shaky clip from inside the courtroom showing Amara on the stand, her voice steady, her words cutting through the billionaire's defense like glass shards. The caption read, "Her truth changed everything." The phone in. Their small living room buzzed endlessly. Messages from people they hadn't heard from in years. Flooded in, some congratulating, some asking questions, some sharing their own stories of injustice. Her father answered a few, then silenced the device. Setting it face down on the table, he told her they needed to breathe, to let the noise of the outside world fade for a moment. She agreed. But in truth, she couldn't quite stop the hum of adrenaline in her veins, her body still replaying every second of her testimony and the look on the billionaire's face when he realized she wasn't afraid. That night, the house felt both too small and impossibly safe. The quiet wrapped around them like a blanket, but beyond the walls, she knew the city was still alive, with the echo of what had happened. People debating, arguing, defending, doubting. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the months that had led here. The moments when she almost walked away when the weight of fighting, someone so untouchable, seemed unbearable. She thought of her father's tired hands, the lines in his face, the way he had sat in that courtroom looking at her as if she was his only hope. Meanwhile, across town, the billionaire sat alone in a penthouse. That felt colder than it ever had before. The city lights spilling in through the floor-to-ceiling windows meant nothing to him. Tonight on his desk lay a stack of legal documents, each one a reminder that losing the case was only the beginning. Lawsuits were coming. Business partners were pulling away. Investors were calling in debts. The empire he had built on arrogance and control was beginning to crack. And for the first time in decades, there was nothing he could buy or threaten his. Way out of morning came with a softness, the sky painted in pale gold and quiet gray. Amara stood by the window, a mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the neighborhood. Slowly wake children walking to school, shopkeepers unlocking doors. The world, moving on as though yesterday had been just another day. But she knew it hadn't been. Something had shifted both in her and in the way others saw her. Her father joined her by the window, neither speaking for a long moment until he finally said, "Today you rest, tomorrow we decide what's next." She nodded, knowing he was right, but also feeling that a part of her was already leaning toward the next battle. Later that week, a community meeting was called at the old church down the street. People filled the wooden pews, faces familiar, and knew many came just to thank her. Others wanted to know how they could fight their own battles against injustice. She spoke carefully that night, not in the sharp, deliberate cadence of the courtroom, but in the honest, open tone of someone speaking to family. She told them the truth was not a weapon you used carelessly. It was a fire, and once lit, it would burn away lies. But it could also burn you if you weren't ready to stand in its heat. When she stepped outside after the meeting, the air was crisp, the street lamps casting halos in the night. She could feel eyes on her, not in the way of judgment, but in recognition and quiet respect as she walked home with her father. She realized that even though the trial was over, the real story was still unfolding, and it was one she was no longer afraid to tell. The weeks after the verdict felt like walking through the aftermath of a storm, the kind that had torn everything apart, but also left the air sharper, cleaner. Somehow, every news outlet had moved on to the next scandal, but whispers of her story still rippled through conversations at bus stops, in grocery store aisles, in coffee shops. The trial had been a spotlight that burned bright, then dimmed, yet its heat lingered. For Amara, the quiet was both a relief and a challenge. She had grown so used to fighting that stillness felt foreign, but her father insisted she take it. He told her battles were not meant to be fought back to back without pause. He said, strength wasn't just about standing up, it was also about knowing when to sit down and heal. She listened, mostly spending mornings reading on the porch, afternoons walking the long stretch of park that bordered their neighborhood. Sometimes strangers would stop her to thank her, and she would smile, accept their gratitude, and move on, never quite knowing what to say that would feel right. The billionaire, however, had no such peace. His empire unraveled faster than he could contain it. First came the frozen accounts, then the government investigations, then the exodus of board members, each departure another public wound. Investors no longer returned his calls, and the few who did only wanted to discuss their exit strategies at night. He found himself unable to sleep, pacing the polished floors of his penthouse replaying. The moment Amara's voice had cut through the courtroom, every word hitting with precision, he had underestimated her thought she was just a pawn in her father's case. But now he realized she had been the queen all along, one evening nearly 2 months after the trial. Amara was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when her father walked in holding a thick envelope. He said it had been delivered by hand, no return address. She wiped her hands and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of expensive paper, and on it, in careful handwritten script, were just a few lines. "You were right. I was wrong. It will not fix what I've done, but I will not fight the restitution any longer. Do with this what you will." Beneath the words was a signature so precise she recognized it instantly. She showed it to her father, his brow furrowed as he read it twice. Then he told her not to trust it too much. Men like him didn't change overnight, but Amara sensed something different this time. Maybe it wasn't remorse, maybe it was simply defeat, but either way it was an opening. They decided together to channel the restitution into something lasting, something bigger than themselves within weeks. They had set up a foundation aimed at supporting those wrongfully targeted by powerful institutions. They named it after her mother, who had passed years earlier, the woman who had taught Amara to value truth above all else. When the foundation launched it, drew both praise and skepticism. But Amara didn't care. Her measure of success wasn't in headlines anymore. It was in the quiet victories, the people whose lives were changed without the world ever knowing their names. One autumn morning, she found herself standing at the courthouse again, but this time not as a witness. She was there to watch a young man barely 20 take the stand in a case eerily similar to her father's. His hands trembled as he began to speak, but when he glanced toward the gallery and saw her there, his shoulders straightened, his voice steadied, and for the briefest moment she saw herself reflected in him. Walking out of the courthouse later, she realized this was the legacy, not the verdict. Not the billionaire's downfall, not even the foundation. It was the chain reaction of courage, one person lighting a spark in another until the fire was impossible to put out. She smiled at the thought, feeling the weight of everything she had endured, not as a burden anymore, but as proof, far away in his now modest apartment. The billionaire sat at a small desk writing another letter. This one longer, more detailed. He spoke of choices he regretted, bridges he had burned, and a strange, unfamiliar freedom that came with having nothing left to protect. He didn't know if he would send it, but for the first time in years, he felt the need to be heard, without agenda. Without gain, as for Amara, she kept moving forward, her days filled with work that mattered. Nights spent in the comfort of home. The past still a shadow, but one she had learned to walk beside, and when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw just the girl who had faced the judge. She saw the woman who had shaken the whole courtroom and kept walking. The storm had passed, but the air was still sharp and clean, and she knew it would always be that way now.